Greetings ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Total War Warhammer 2 potential Dark Elf army units video. And in this video we'll be exploring the potential units that will make up the Dark Elf army in Total War Warhammer 2, or the first expansion, whichever you prefer to call it. Now, I'm taking all of these units from the 8th edition of the game, just because that seems to be the basis upon which most of Creative Assembly's decisions as far as units and legendary lords and things like that have been taken from. So, starting off with the lords. Now, the lords are not the legendary lords, chaps. If you guys want some history, some context, some information on who I think the legendary lords for the Dark Elves will be, please check the upper right hand corner, and that will be the video popping up for my legendary lord lore video for the Dark Elves coming up in Total War Warhammer 2. Now, there's a lot of history about the Dark Elves as a people. In fact, most of their history is contained in the Malekith and Morathi or Morify section of that video, so do check that out. If you don't see it pop up in the right hand corner, do check the description, there'll be a link in there. As far as lords in this video is concerned, I'm talking about the kind of generic generals that we get in Dark Elf armies. Now, a thing to bear in mind with lords and Total War Warhammer is that so far, with variety of different generals, we've not really had very much from races when they first start out. I think the most we've had is maybe two types of generals, so I imagine a few of these types will actually be cut from Total War Warhammer 2 at launch, and we'll only have a couple of them, but others may be added in DLC, and I'll let you guys know which ones I think are which as we go on. So to start things off, the Dreadlord. Now, the Dreadlord can effectively be your typical kind of melee general, as sort of the equivalent of the Empire General or the Dwarf General or even the Beast Lord, just a kind of melee fighter. But on the tabletop, the Dreadlord actually has a lot of equipment choices, and you can choose to equip him with missile weapons, with a halberd, with two-hand weapons. There's quite a bit of choice as far as the Dreadlord goes. But I think this might be expressed in Total War Warhammer by kind of giving you the same choice they did with the Wood Elf DLC, whereby you can choose either to make the Dreadlord a melee-focused lord or a missile-focused lord. And I think those will be the two options. Of course, Dreadlords don't use bows like the Wood Elves do. Instead, they would use repeater crossbows or repeater handbows. Those would be the options for the Dreadlord. But that's a possibility of what Creative Assembly might do, but really odds are on the favor of them sticking with Dreadlords being a kind of melee-focused lord to start things off with in the game. Now, Dreadlords themselves are made up of the nobles of Nagaroth, which is the kingdom of the Dark Elves. And as with many Dark Elves, they're supremely arrogant. They have their own unique ambitions and have proven to be selfish. And they have their own unique ambitions and have often proven to be selfish in pursuing those. They have attained their rank through either bloodlines or by gaining the favor of the Witch King himself. Another way that Dreadlords can maybe be recognized, they're just soldiers of some repute. They can receive something known as an Iron Writ, and this is essentially granting them the powers of the sponsor of this Iron Writ, and they have all the authority to speak on that person's behalf in order to carry out a certain task. So it's sort of mission orientated, this temporary power. Now, if they fail to pass this mission, the Iron Writ, which is literally a tablet of iron with their orders on it, gets melted down and poured down their throats if they fail. I think this could maybe be incorporated as some kind of interesting mechanic in Total War Warhammer 2. I'm not exactly sure how you do it. It might just be one of those pop-up messages that give you a certain mission to go to a certain area, and if you fail the mission, there's consequences on your character. Maybe they get reduced hit points or something like that for future missions and ongoing things if they fail to achieve their missions in Total War Warhammer 2. That could be a way of going about implementing the lore of this Iron Writ system that they have amongst the Dark Elves. The martial prowess of the Dreadlords have been formed over many centuries of battling their way to the top of the Dark Elf hierarchy. In fact, the nobles of these rich and powerful families often have to fight amongst their siblings for power, leading to multiple assassination attempts amongst siblings, just straight out dueling and murder. And if they survive this bit to their point where they're kind of entering their early teens or late teens, growing into adulthood essentially, The survivors of this family infighting are then sent on a 1-year-long raiding mission in order to earn their right to stand in Dark Elf society. And the expectation is they go out into the world, they make their mark, they prove their worth as valiant generals and fighters, and essentially they prove their worth as a killing machine or at the head of an army, and then return home. Now, those who fail to prove their worth are often done away by their own family for bringing disrepute to the family name, and weakness is despised amongst Dark Elves, so if you are going to bring any kind of air of weakness to a noble house, they'll probably kill you before you get back, before you skulk back from your failed raiding attempt. If they do get back, they are accepted into High Elf society and can begin to climb that social ladder to reach the rank of Dreadlord. Now let's take this metaphorical ladder. It has very greasy rungs, and many more have died trying to achieve the rank of Dreadlord than have ever actually achieved the rank itself. Once Dreadlords do reach their height of power, they are not really the lead by example, inspire your troops, charge headfirst into battle type. They're more the stand behind the soldiers with their whips, and if the soldiers turn back to run away, you'll kill them yourself. It's said that Dark Elf soldiers prefer to die at the hands of enemies, because at least if they die at the hands of enemies, rather than running away, they won't be faced by their Dreadlord, who will not only kill them, but probably kill some members of their families as well, just to sort of ram home that point. But when they are drawn into combat, they are remarkably effective, as I say. Growing up in Nagroth itself is a bit of a war, so anyone who can survive that probably has some very good martial skills. And in this environment of backstabbing and political scheming and sycophantic political schemers hidden in every nook and cranny, there's a kind of etiquette that's evolved around Nagroth, particularly involving nobles, and it's how far away or how close people are allowed to stand to you at any given time in normal circumstances. So if any noble dreadlord just wandering around the city, lowborn elves or slaves or anything like that, aren't allowed to get within 3 sword lengths of you. Now those in your service, in your retinue, are allowed within 2 sword lengths. Now your most trusted servants, they're allowed just over 1 sword length away. And in Dark Elf society, the only people allowed within 1 sword length of you as a noble or as a dreadlord are your lovers, your playthings at the time in Dark Elf society, that's whoever you're torturing, molesting, or doing any other amount of unspeakable things to, and your most hated foe, because it's safer to have your most hated foe within sword's length than have them further away. That's the thinking of Dark Elves. So yeah, if a Dark Elf noble lets you get close, it's either a good thing or a horrible thing, so watch out for that. In terms of their mounts, we see a Dreadlord here mounted on a Black Dragon. Now Black Dragons are dragons stolen from Ulthuan who have been hatched through dark magics of the Dark Elves. I said dark a bit too much in one sentence, but there you go. And this is what's given them their odd hue. They can also ride dark steeds, which are effectively horses that the Dark Elves use. They can ride cold ones, which are effectively a kind of raptor, essentially, that is often used as a mount in Dark Elf society. They can use cold one chariots, they can use Dark Pegasus, and they can use manticores as well. And that sort of rounds out the mount options for the Dreadlord. But I'm pretty sure we'll get the Dreadlord just as that kind of generic melee-focused general that we've had in almost every army in Total War Warhammer so far, so odds are good that the Dreadlord will make an appearance. Next up, we have Supreme Sorceresses. Now, these are the best of the best of the best of the sorceresses that Nagroth has to offer. Now, in terms of Supreme Sorceresses and sorceresses in general in the Dark Elf Society, most of them are pupils of Morathi, or Morify, depending on your preferred pronunciation. Now, she is the mother of Malekith, the king of the Dark Elves, and she was really the first to flirt with using the dark powers of chaos to kind of invent lore onto her own, which is this dark magic lore. And she's been teaching this to her sorceress understudies. Now, she was the first one to kind of straddle that line between normal winds of magic, between winds of magic as have been usable by elves historically, and bringing in this kind of chaos influence, because anyone who tried before had been driven mad or had succumbed to the perversions of chaos. Not to say that Morathi hasn't necessarily done that. But she's said to have sort of straddled that line by incorporating a number of blood sacrifices and carrying out a number of dark rituals to enable her to delve into this area of magic. And she started this group of magic sorceresses in her city of Grond, which is a little bit north of the capital of Nagroth. And it's there she really holds court and is the center of this dark covenant of sorceresses. Now you might ask, what about the blokes in Dark Elf Society? And yes, there are magically talented men in Dark Elf Society, but these are living in hiding or have essentially been hunted to extinction. Because Malekith once came across a prophecy known as the Prophecy of Demise, which spoke of a great warrior being driven away from his home by a sorcerer. And so Malekith, in his arrogance, assuming this great warrior was of course him, has decided that all sorcerers need to be put to death, and he's put bounties on their heads of any male practicing sorcerer, and he essentially tries to hunt them to non-existence. So you won't find them in Malekith's ranks, plodding along with the sorceresses, because they're all in hiding or all dead, effectively. The members of Morathi's coven aren't necessarily restricted just to the dark lore of magic. They also have access to the other 8 laws of magic that the Empire has used, that you'd have seen before, celestial, light, shadow, metal, that kind of thing. So they have access to all the other laws of magic as well. But the sorceresses themselves only have access to one of these, whereas Morathi, who's the kind of supreme sorceress of the Dark Elf Society, has access to several of these in the tabletop version of the game. And that about sums it up for the Supreme Sorceresses. We've had magic generals before in Total War Warhammer, and I think these are the other kind of shoe-in for the open spot, and I think we'll have the Dreadlords and the Supreme Sorceresses as the generals of the Dark Elves in Total War Warhammer 2, or the first expansion. Now moving on, we have the ones that I don't necessarily think will make it, starting off with the High Beastmaster. Now I very much see the High Beastmaster coming in as some sort of DLC later on in Total War Warhammer 2, but I don't think there'll be an option for a starting general at the beginning of the game. Essentially, the Beastmasters in Dark Elf Society tend to hail from their cities of Klar, Karond, or Karond Kar, and they tend to be based mainly out of there. They go around hunting great monsters from the hills and mountains and seas around Nagaroth, and kind of just essentially enslave them to serve the Dark Elves and to fight in their battles. They have an ability called Beast Slaver, which gives a huge boost to monsters within a certain distance of them in the tabletop version of the game. Now, I think in Total War Warhammer, it wouldn't be a radius thing, it'd probably be a map-wide boost to all monster units. And these guys would be not dissimilar to how they built Isabella in Total War Warhammer, where they'll have a lot of buffs to monstrous units, monstrous infantry, monsters in general, and you'll be kind of encouraged to have kind of a monster-focused army with these guys leading the charge. They're just essentially sort of cunning trappers and hunters, and they will, with a flick of their whip, manage to enslave even the largest of beasts in the Warhammer world. And it said they kind of have a unique ability to do this due to the kind of innate connection that all elves have with nature and a kind of empathy they can build with living things. But whereas the high elves kind of like trees and the wood elves really love trees, these guys have been more like, okay, well, we'll use it to enslave huge monsters and they'll go to war for us, rather than use it in any kind of wisdom-sharing way or appreciating the beauty of the earth type way. They're more of a, all right, let's watch it bite things' heads off. That will be a fantastic afternoon. So they've taken that aspect to their innate gifts of understanding aspects of nature. So good for you, Dark Elves, keeping it true to your reputation. But that's the High Beastmasters. The next lords we have are the Black Ark Fleet Masters. Now, essentially, these guys, as you guys know, as many of you guys who are used to my channel know, I've done a series on possible naval combat units in Total War Warhammer and what they'll look like, taking the unit from the Games Workshop game Man of War, where they laid out naval combat in the Warhammer universe. Do check that out. It'll appear on the top right corner or be in the description if you want to have a look over that later. But I think the Black Ark Fleet Masters won't necessarily appear as land units in Total War Warhammer. Even later on with DLC, I don't think any army has 4 types of generic general at the moment. Let me know if I'm wrong on that. It's just maybe not coming to the forefront of my mind. I'm pretty sure there's some armies with several of them, but I don't think any of them have 4 at the moment. And that's not counting the different magic users with different laws. That's counting all sorcerers as one kind of general. So these guys I think will appear as admirals if they appear at all. and they'll lead any kind of fleet, and you'll be able to upgrade them from there. But essentially, these guys are the pirate masters of the Dark Elves, and piracy is a huge part of what drives the Dark Elf economy, and these guys will be leading the charge out on the open oceans of Total War Warhammer 2, and really, we should see naval combat in Total War Warhammer 2. Fingers crossed we do, but you never know. They might just not implement it at all, in which case I doubt we'll see the Black Ark Fleet Masters appearing. More so because anyone who's not necessarily familiar with them on tabletop might just find it confusing and weird that they've put up Black Ark Fleet Masters on the land battles, but they haven't instituted any kind of naval combat. It would just be silly, really. So that's my theory on the Black Ark Fleet Masters, renowned pirates who have built fearsome reputations through years of raiding the lands all over the world and bringing back huge wealth to Nagaroth itself. Moving on to the hero units in the Dark Elf army, we will start off with the Masters. Now, the Masters are essentially your Empire captains, essentially your paladins. These guys will be the ones who get exemplar and training and recruitment lowering costs. These will be your melee focused heroes. That's who they'll be in Total War Warhammer 2, and I definitely see these guys being implemented. I don't see how you'd miss them out, because they have matching counterparts in all the other factions so far in Total War, so there'd be no reason we wouldn't get a Dark Elf equivalent, which would be the Masters. Now, Masters are essentially a kind of downgraded version of the Dreadlords, effectively. So that's who the Masters will be. The Sorceresses we've kind of covered. The Sorceress is not a Supreme Sorceress, but she's still pretty good. She'll have a Law of Magic, much like all Sorcerers do in Total War Warhammer. You guys know how the magic users work. They'll have access, they should theoretically have access to all the laws of magic as they currently exist in Total War Warhammer, as well as this dark magic, which the Dark Elves have access to, which we haven't seen in Total War Warhammer as of yet. Khainite Assassins. Now, these guys are going to be your equivalent of the Witch Hunters. They're going to be Assassin Supreme of the Dark Elves. These guys should be the best assassins in the game, arguably until we see the Skaven introduced, but they are pretty badass. They're said to have heightened senses and heightened precision over a normal elf, being able to blindfolded jump onto the spear of an enemy phalanx, run down it, and kill the person on the end of the spear. That's how talented they're said to be. Now, the Khainite Assassins work for the Cult of Khain, and for those of you guys who saw my Legendary Lord video for the Dark Elves, know that I think the Cult of Khain will be a sub-faction of the Dark Elves in Total War Warhammer 2, and I think they'll just get a bonus to Assassins, but all Dark Elf factions will get access to the Assassins, if you see what I mean. They won't be limited to the Cult of Khain sub-faction. Everyone will be able to use them. Now, the Khainite Assassins are heavily employed in a society like that of the Dark Elves, with siblings plotting assassinations, with family members trying to wipe out other family members, with opposing clans trying to wipe out each other. Assassination is rife in the Kingdom of Nagaroth, and so the Khainite Assassins are never short of work. Now, they tend to work for a couple of things, for wealth, obviously, but for sacrifices as well, and for political favor later on down the line. Now, in terms of the tabletop rules and how that might translate to Total War Warhammer 2, they have an ability on the tabletop where they can blend into units and kind of spring out, much like the Fanatics do in Total War Warhammer at the moment. But I don't think that's how we'll see them implemented in the battles of Total War Warhammer 2. They'll be very much like an agent. You'll be able to boost them. I think they should have essentially, I think it's Infiltrate, the trait, where they essentially remain hidden until they're within a certain range of somebody. And I think that range should be extremely small for the Assassins. They should essentially be able to sneak about the map however they want. They won't have a mount, however. Assassins don't have mounts on the tabletop version of the game. And they'll have poison on their blades. As in the lore, they have poison blades, which are said to cause sort of such spasming that it burns out nerve endings, that it causes one to convulse so hard that one shatters one's own bones, and then the heart explodes and gives out. And they tend to take a absolute pleasure in watching this happen to their victims. So they should have poison on their weaponry, and maybe even in Vanguard to just kind of signify that infiltrating aspect of the Khainite Assassins in Total War Warhammer. So that's how I see them being translated onto the battle maps. In terms of the the campaign map, you guys have seen it. It would be very much like the witch hunters. They'll get bonuses to their assassination chances. That's what they'll really specialize in. We can very much see how the assassin would be translated over in terms of their campaign map traits and how they play on the campaign map, really. Now, another interesting mechanic they could introduce, but I'm not holding out hope for it, it's more of an idea I've had myself, is that the Knight assassins are known for being supreme interrogators. They are excellent torturers and often get the truth out of people through torture, and that could maybe be interesting for when you kill a enemy agent. Maybe part of that enemy's empire or map is revealed from the fogs of war, and you can kind of get an idea of what's going on the map, maybe even just for one turn before it disappears again. But because you managed to assassinate a target, you got the intel from them, because they tend, like, if it's just one target isolated, they'll take their time and spend a lot of time torturing and molesting any poor soul they get their hands on. So that would be a cool little mechanic, but I doubt we'll see it. But that's just an idea off the top of my head that I'd like to see implemented for the Knight assassins. Now, I mentioned their poison. There are several types of poison that the assassins use, and this could maybe play into their upgrade tree. You can maybe get one of these types of poison, or maybe all three of these types of poison. But essentially, the types of poison are Dark Venom, which gives the assassin Killing Blow, essentially, the Killing Blow trait, which we've seen other units have in Total War Warhammer. So it could be a temporary ability, or just an ability that matches Killing Blow, called Dark Venom. They have Black Lotus, which is essentially a leadership debuff for anyone they hit. So yeah, minus leadership for anyone around them when they click that option or have that as an ability that goes on. And they have Manbane, which essentially would be a buff to their own melee skill. So it'd be great to see them have each one of those poisons that they can use interchangeably or just as abilities, and have them selectable as options in the battle map, and that could be translated over. So I'd really like to see that happen with the Knight assassins. And that really sums it up for the assassins. So these guys will be an invaluable unit on the campaign map, and, you know, pretty handy, I'm sure, for sneaking about and maybe picking off magic users who are staying behind their army lines or stuff like that. It could be pretty useful for doing things, because especially if you've got a magic user on foot, you have an assassin who's going to kill him in melee, and he's poisoned that magic user, so he can't escape really. And elves are quicker than humans, particularly, so can't escape. And essentially, if an assassin gets a magic user isolated and engages them in melee combat, that magic user's done for, essentially, unless they're on a mount and can escape quicker that way. So that's pretty cool, and that's something I'm looking forward to seeing in Total War Warhammer 2. Next up, we have the Death Hag, and this is essentially the special Witch Elf unit. Now, Witch Elves we'll get into a little bit more detail later on in this video, but effectively the Death Hag is an upgraded Witch Elf unit with a couple of other abilities. And now, I don't necessarily think we're going to see Death Hags as hero units in Total War Warhammer 2. Instead, what I think is going to happen is they're going to take some of the traits of the Death Hags and just put them onto Witch Elf units in general. Now, Death Hags have a couple of unique things about them, but the problem is that in the campaign map for Total War Warhammer, which is really where heroes kind of come into their own and do certain things on the campaign map, there's not really any obvious space for what Witch Elves would do in the campaign map that would differentiate them from some of the heroes we've already discussed. They kind of drive units into frenzy, but that's all kind of battle map stuff. That's not stuff that happens on the campaign surface map. So what I see happening is these guys just being integrated into Witch Elves as a unit, maybe Death Hags being called an upgrade for Witch Elves in general, but they'll be a unit rather than a hero, and they'll have sort of upgraded traits from regular Witch Elves. I think we'll see something like that rather than having Death Hags as hero units in their own right, which is a shame. They'd look cool, but there's no obvious way to fit them into the campaign map gameplay, at least that I can see. Let me know in the comments if you guys think differently. But the way I see it, you'll have assassins, you'll have masters, and you'll have sorceresses on the campaign map of Total War Warhammer for the Dark Elves, and you won't have Death Hags as a hero. Moving on to the infantry, guys. We'll start off with some of the more basic infantry. We have the Dread Spears. Now, the Dread Spears consider themselves the true soldiers of the Dark Elf army. Steadfast and disciplined, they fight as a unit, presenting a shield wall, really just doing their jobs as soldiers. There's no showboating, they just get the job done. They're highly disciplined, they have a relatively high leadership for what they are, which is essentially the basic spearmen of the Dark Elf army. But they will hold the line, while some of the other infantry units and other units in the Dark Elf army who tend to lose themselves in the wild slaughter of enemies around the battlefield kind of run about manically. But these guys will hold the line, fight off any enemies, and allow the lunatics to charge around the flanks and the back. So that's who the Dread Spears will be. As with all spear units we've had in Total War Warhammer so far, they'll probably have an anti-large bonus, they'll probably have a charge defense against large as well, and they may play around with it and give them a shielded and non-shielded variety to kind of put them up that upgrade progression, as they did with Wood Elves and Eternal Warriors. So I think we might see that as well with the shielded and non-shielded variety, obviously non-shielded being the earlier type you get, and then they'll go into the shielded variety later on. So that's Dread Spears for you. Next up, we have Black Guard. Now this is a much more elite unit and kind of the upgraded version of Dread Spears as far as Total War Warhammer will play out. These are essentially an elite halberdier unit. These guys are Malekith's personal guard. As you guys know who watched the Dark Elf Legendary Lords video I did submit that Malekith will run a faction called the Dark Elves, and Helbrun will run a faction known as the Cult of Cain. Now, the Cult of Cain shouldn't have access to Blackguard unless they've confederated with or taken the capital of Nagaroth, and then they can recruit Blackguard. But this is essentially your ultimate anti-large, your ultimate charge defense unit. These guys will put down some big monsters pretty quick. They can be heavily or lightly armored. They're recruited from amongst the ranks of the families most loyal to Malekith. He takes babies almost immediately after their birth, has their mothers killed, although how that kind of endears loyalty to you, I'm not 100% sure amongst families who like you. It's Malekith's priority, whatever gets him off. So he has the mothers killed and the babies are raised within the barracks. Now, the barracks themselves are set up to be uber competitive from the get-go. There are 20 towers in the barracks of the Black Guard where they compete against each other for supremacy in the rankings. And each group has a tower captain. From the time you can hold a weapon, you will engage in duels to the death, and essentially only the fittest survive. The fittest, the canniest, the quickest survive in the upbringing of the Black Guard, and that's how you end up with this truly elite halberdier fighting force. If you survive all the training, all the death duels from the age of say 4 upwards, and you make it into the Black Guard, Malekith then sort of comes up and says, congratulations. Now, what you'll do as a member of the Black Guard is you'll serve me for 200 years. After that 200 years is up, you will have huge amounts of money and huge amounts of land. And indeed, a number of the surviving Black Guard have gone on to run cities in their own right, have gone on to become exceedingly wealthy and pivotal members of Malekith's court itself. So he really has recruited his ruling elite from within the ranks of the Black Guard, at least those who survived the years of service and the rigors of training. Now, these guys are so disciplined in terms of tabletop conversion of how they might play in Total War Warhammer, is they are immune to psychology, so psychology won't get to them at all. They have high leadership. So moving on from the Black Guard, we have the Bleak Swords. Now, the Bleak Swords are a core infantry unit, much like the Dread Spears. It is said, however, that all Dark Elves are known to be arrogant, but Bleak Swords raise their arrogance to a level beyond tolerance. Each member of the Bleak Swords thinks themselves the greatest warrior to have ever lived in their age, and tend to favor the sword and shield of fighting, thinking the spear to be a peasant's weapon and the repeater crossbow to be a weapon of cowards. Now, it must be said that the Dread Spears themselves think the Bleak Swords poorly suited soldiers, thinking them more kind of lunatic showboating adventurers than rather disciplined soldiers as they should be. So there's a little bit of animosity there between the two types of Dark Elf troop. But that's the Bleak Swords, looking to cause as much mayhem and damage as they can, a bit of flair, a bit of showboating, very much the swashbucklers of the core of the Dark Elf armies, but effectively an equivalent to swordsmen in an army, say like the Empire. Now, sticking with the swordsman aspect of the Dark Elf army, let's move on to the Har Ganeth Executioners. Now, I touched on the Executioners a little bit in my Dark Elf Legendary Lord video, but the Executioners effectively were born when a High Elf army attacked Har Ganeth, and they were all captured, and essentially it kicked off many days of executions, and the heads of the captured High Elf soldiers rolled down the stairs of the Temple to Cain in Har Ganeth, and ever since then the Executioners have been a mainstay of the, shall we say, scenery in Har Ganeth. Every crime in that one city is punishable with execution, and so the Executioners have made quite a name for themselves. Now, the Executioners, similarly to the Blackguard, are under the singular control of Helbrun, the mistress of Har Ganeth. And so if you were to have a Cult of Cain sub-faction, the Executioners would appear under her control and not under Malekith's. So until Malekith either took the city or confederated with Helbrun. In terms of their day-to-day, Executioners spend half of their day on patrol or in sentry, and the other half of their day practicing their deadly strikes. Now, the Executioners are cold. They're not sort of rabid, frenzying killers. They're cold, calculating killers, and they practice their death strikes every single day, looking to really use the least amount of effort to gain the most amount of kills. It's said their strikes can be so precise, the best of the Executioners can kill 5 men with a single swipe of his sword. Now, the weapon the Executioners use is described as the Dreich, and the Dreich is forged by the Executioners themselves under the supervision of the armorers at the Temple of Cain. But they each make their own weapons, and some prefer a kind of heavy axe design, others prefer a more sort of slender sword design, but they each come up with their own designs for their blades. If we were to see these guys translated across to Total War Warhammer, we'd love to see them have probably an area of effect hit, because they do these huge swiping blows. It'd be great to see them have some kind of vigor reduction as well, because I like this idea of them trying to expend as little energy as possible in the killing they're doing. So just like have them take very little negative vigor effects, because that's what they're doing. The Executioners are saving energy, killing with ruthless efficiency, effectively. They are a unit that would have on the tabletop are given the ability Killing Blow. So that might be quite cool to transfer over to Total War Warhammer and make them, I think they would be the first unit with Killing Blow. We've had individual sort of single units, but the first multiple man unit with Killing Blow. That would be very cool to see. So that's the Executioners for you. They look pretty badass with their kind of elf skull helmets. And yeah, precise and effective killers with great weapons. Next up, we have the Dark Shards. Now, these are the missile infantry of the Dark Elf army, each armed with a repeater crossbow, which can fire multiple shots and is reloaded through a magazine type system. They take great pride in their marksmanship, and although are mocked from time to time for having a coward's weapon, they are truly effective killers. It must be said that just because they choose to kill from distance doesn't mean they don't take the same kind of delightful pleasure in seeing the agony of others. So it's said that even though Dark Shards have the ability to hit someone through the eye, they prefer sometimes to go for a gut shot and just hear the screams over the cries of battle of the soldiers they've hit dying slowly in agony. So just because they shoot arrows doesn't mean they're not complete bastards as well. That's the Dark Shards for you. They should be able to, I think they should be able to fire quicker than any other unit in the game, and you should just be this kind of near constant volley of arrows going over the battlefield. So they could be quite devastating, I think, once used in Total War Warhammer. And moving on from the Dark Shards, another missile infantry unit are the Shades. Now, the ancestors to the Shades ruled the city of Clarcurrand, but they were betrayed and exiled to the wilderness, where they've been kind of eking out an existence ever since, having to learn to move silently through the wilderness, avoid or kill dreaded monsters that tend to wander the lands of Nagaroth, and they've become sort of hardy scouts and wilderness men, and are armed with a hand weapon and a hand repeater bow, which is essentially a smaller version of the repeater crossbow. It's said they've learned the gifts of being able to move silently through horribly rocky terrain and forest, and every day for them is a battle for survival, so they're truly hardened soldiers. Now, the way these guys would probably be translated across into Total War Warhammer would be to give them infiltrate. They'd operate very much like the Dwarven Rangers. They'd be hidden until they get within range. They'd be half-decent hand-to-hand combatants, as well as being skirmishing missile combatants as well. So they can sneak up on war machines and take them out from the back. They can sort of approach from the rear and start firing their repeater handbows into the rears of enemy units. Kind of essentially just a skirmisher unit. Very effective tool if used in the right situations, with their ability to sneak around the battlefield and set ambushes and fire down on enemies. So I really look forward to using the Shades. I do imagine they'll operate very much like the Rangers in the Dwarven armies as they stand at the moment. And that's the Shades for you. Moving on, we have the Black Ark Corsairs. Now these guys are essentially the pirates, the crew and fighters of the Dark Elf fleets, which go around pirating and looting the rest of the known world. These guys are savage killers, and some have even been trained by Khainite assassins in their use of their two-weapon style of combat. The Corsairs themselves are venerated in Dark Elf society because although their jobs may be hard going around the world reaving and murdering, and they have to face near constant battle, if they do return from years of raiding, they can sometimes return some of the wealthiest men in Nagaroth. Due to their fighting on decks of ships, up the masts of ships, in small alleys by docks of the cities they're raiding, they tend to favor short, quick weapons and prefer quick striking blades rather than great weapons or anything like that. So that's why they tend to avoid the shield, they avoid heavy armor. Instead, what they're armed with is a sea dragon cloak, which provides them some decent protection against enemies, but it also allows them to be quick and mobile, and that's really the way Corsairs are built for their fighting. They want to be quick, they want to be vicious, they get in there with both their weapons and start slashing and hacking away like the reavers they are, taking vast amounts of plunder and slaves back to Nagaroth and really making a name for themselves. So that's the Black Ark Corsairs. Now, if we don't see the Black Ark Fleet Masters, we may not see the Corsairs unless they are a particular naval combat unit that we can see with boarding parties and stuff like that. That would be pretty cool, but they are very much tied to the sea. It would be fun to see them because I think they look great, and with their sea dragon cloaks, that kind of greenish animal skin cloaks that they all wear, would be quite a striking unit to see in Total War Warhammer. But I'm not sure about these guys. We might see them in naval combat, we might see them in battles, in sort of land battles, or we might not see them at all. If I was going to bet on a unit being cut from the kind of general infantry, it might be these guys, just because there is that kind of niche filled by some more iconic units in the Dark Elf army. That's at least my thinking on it. If we see them, that'd be great. I have no objection against the Black Ark Corsairs, but I have a sneaking suspicion, because their niche is filled, because they very much are a naval combat, or at least their lore is very much tied to naval combat and raiding and going on ships, that we may not see them in the cut of the Dark Elf army if we don't see naval combat in the game. But they do have a couple of neat traits that might be translated nicely across. One of which is the fact that because they're armed with kind of nets and things to trap slaves, the idea could be for one of their mechanics is that they have an aura around them kind of like the Chillgeist, and that aura itself slows down enemies, so you could maybe make it harder for enemies to flee away from the Black Ark Corsairs because they would chase them down, and elves are quicker than humans in particular, so they'd especially be able to chase down humans who decided to flee from them in combat. So that could be pretty cool. I think if we do see them, they'll maybe come as part of a DLC with Lockyer Fellhart, who's probably the most well-known admiral stroke pirate captain that the Dark Elves have in their retinue of characters. So they'd maybe come in a DLC pack with him later on down the line if they don't appear at the launch of the game itself. Although I would love to see that pack tied into naval combat in some way, shape or form, but that's enough about me going on about naval combat. Let's move on. We have the Sisters of Slaughter. Now, over the entirety of Nagaroth, the kingdom of the Dark Elves, every single city has a gladiator arena. It's one of the most favored forms of entertainment in Nagaroth. They love watching themselves some blood sport, whether it's traitors being eaten by monsters, gladiators fighting each other, gladiators fighting monsters. It's all good as long as there's blood being spilled somewhere. Now, the Sisters of Slaughter got their start as just a dozen sisters from a single ruling family in Naggaroth who were betrayed, disgraced, and then dispossessed. They then pledged themselves to the elven god Eldrazer. Now, Eldrazer is the Lord of Blades, and they asked him to help in their quest for vengeance. Now, they carved their metal blades into the bones of their enemies long ago, but the Sisters of Slaughter have continued to grow to become the prime gladiatorial fighting guild in Naggaroth, and they train the finest gladiators around, and they all just happen to be women. Their idea is that the Lord Eldrazer gave them a gift of a kind of killer instinct. They don't have much soldiering discipline, and in fact the only time they really turn up into battle is when they've kind of grown sick of just slaughtering everything in the arena, and they feel like getting a new challenge. So they go and they offer themselves to armies or to raiding fleets, and they say, how about having us along? And any dreadlord would be a fool to turn them down. So they go along, and they don't really fight for money or wealth or anything like that. They're just looking for a new challenge, the next foe to face, to see if anyone in the world can be better than them. It's said because of this lack of discipline, they're kind of ingrained with a sense of instinct on how to fight, and it's thought that this is a blessing from Eldrazer himself to the Sisters of Slaughter, just blessing them with an instinct for combat rather than necessarily them committing themselves to huge reams of training and stuff like that. They tend to just launch in and fight and then go out, have a party, launch into the next fight. Not a lot of training gets done. So on the battlefield, you'll see these Sisters of Slaughter sort of gaily laughing away to themselves, with nary care in the world, dancing gleefully into battle, and it's said that they can bypass entire shield walls with a single leap, jumping right over them and just massacring the unit in behind. So these guys could have quite a stunning charge if Creative Assembly do it right. That'd be cool to see these gladiators leap over any kind of formation or any kind of charged defense units and just completely massacre them from the center of their unit body. They have a couple of special rules of Sister of Slaughter. They have the Dance of Death, which is that they're so aerobic and graceful they can kind of dodge any kind of attacks, and this presents itself as a ward save for them on the tabletop of the game. They also have the Trial of Blades, which is when they encounter a unit that is statistically stronger than them, they get a bonus for their chance to hit and the chance to wound. So effectively it's about them meeting an enemy who's better than them and them themselves raising the level, their own level of combat and enjoying the combat that much more because it's a suitable foe. This could be done in Total War Warhammer because you could tie a character trait to them that gives them a bonus when they have the combat stat. There are stronger and faster units nearby, which pops up in battle sometimes if weaker units are fighting better units, and that could kick in their stat effect where they get a stat boost because they're fighting a unit better than them. And that would be something really interesting to have in Total War Warhammer 2 as a stat thing and be very true to the lore and be very cool to see. So that's the Sisters of Slaughter. Next up we have the iconic Dark Elf unit, the Witch Elves, the lunatic Brides of Cain, the Masters of Frenzy, the gorgeous Minxes of Murder. This is the Witch Elves. Now, as I mentioned before, I think we'll have Death Hags be a unit that's just essentially an upgraded version of Witch Elves. But Witch Elves themselves are devoted to Cain, devoted to the elven god of destruction and murder, and they just pledge their lives to being better murderesses, better in combat, giving little regard to their own defense, and just going completely on the attack. These guys are the equivalent of maybe flagellants in the Empire, but just a bit cooler and a bit better, and definitely a lot sexier. They are also the cruelest of Cain's servants, delighting in the torture of their captives and making sacrifices whenever they can get their hands on someone worth sacrificing. They're known to set up these living sacrifices on the shrines of Cain and chanting Cainima, Cainima, Cainima Shaptide as they rip out the hearts of their victims still beating and throw them into the fire. This is the Witch Elves and their cruel sacrifices. In terms of some of their other rituals, before any battle, the Witch Elves drink from an item known as the Cauldron of Blood, which we'll get into a little bit later, essentially a religious ceremonial cauldron, and they put poisoned herbs into it, and drinking this blood and these poisoned herbs drives all the Witch Elves into an absolute frenzy. So come the battle, they launch into a slaughter and just this orgy of gore, covering themselves head to toe in the entrails and blood of their victims, and they take a near orgasmic pleasure from it. Even if you're not directly killed or run through by one of their blades, if you're even nicked, you're likely to have been poisoned, and this poison itself will just make it easier for them to catch you and kill you in more horrific and slower ways. So better just to take the knife to the chest, matey, rather than get captured by these crazy witches. Now, as you may know, the basic witch elves will all have poison as a special rule. The priestesses, the death hags, just going into them a bit in my theory of how they might just be an upgraded model of the witch elves. They have a couple of special items that they can maybe upgrade to. One of these is called the Cry of War, which is the idea that the death hags are screaming the secret names of the god Cain, and that drives people hearing them slightly mad, which essentially presents as a leadership debuff. They also have something called the Rune of Cain, which is a red rune carved into their flesh. It gives them more attacks, essentially, so increasing, I guess, weapon strength would be the equivalent in Total War Warhammer. And they have something called the Witch Brew, which is just essentially the brew that the witches drink to give themselves frenzy. So if you had essentially the witch elves who have poison and frenzy, and then you have the death hags who have poison, frenzy, and a debuff leadership aura around them, as well as maybe higher weapon strength, that's how you could maybe incorporate death hags into the Dark Elf army, and a way I see Creative Assembly doing it in the future. But the Witch Elves, an iconic Dark Elf unit, will definitely be in the game. Their mistress Helbrand will likely be a legendary lord, but check out my thoughts on that in that video. But yeah, fantastic unit, crazy, crazy witches. Moving on, let's start to look at some of the cavalry the Dark Elves have at their disposal, starting with the Dark Riders. These are essentially a kind of scouting light cavalry. Back in the days when there was a unification of the elves and they hadn't had the Civil War yet, the Dark Riders in fact had black cloaks made of raven wings, which was a kind of homage to the elven god Nephu. Now Nephu, as a gift to the Dark Riders, kind of gave them the ability not to be seen by their enemies. So they were kind of scouting riders that would go around and just sort of look out for chaos when it was invading Ulthuan, and report back and send out the armies. These guys are essentially a type of raider. They go out there, they burn villages, they scout, and they're just a quick light cav in Malekith's army. They are very much changed from what they used to be. They've used dark magics on their horses to make them slightly more berserk, and that's something called a dark steed, which I think I mentioned for mounts for dreadlords earlier. But these are essentially purebred horses that have been messed around with the dark magic of the Dark Elves. And these guys essentially would be ideally suited for riding down pistoliers, outriders, and just putting them to the sword, and really not being great against other cavalry or anything like that, but quick, fast, and efficient, just getting about the battlefield, doing the work any good light cavalry should do. Moving on, we have the Cold One Knights. Now the Cold One Knights are knights who have managed to tame these Cold One lizards, which are very similar to kind of velociraptors, but also a little bit different. The Cold Ones live in caves and tunnels below the city of Hagreth. Their flesh is said to be so cold that it's almost immune to pain. They also excrete this kind of toxic slime from their pores on their skin, which is said to be poisonous, but the Dark Elves have some sort of a resistance to it. Now, because these are effectively large velociraptors, they are very hard to tame and are at the same time both very stubborn and stupid creatures. Many would-be Cold Knight has fallen victim to the Cold One he was looking to tame, because even on smell, they look to attack anything that's warm-blooded. Now, the way to get around this and to tame a Cold One is to cover yourself in that slime that they excrete. So you're covering your scent, but because it is poisonous, what it does is effectively it burns away at your nostrils, the smell, it's noxious, and so it robs you of all sense of touch, feeling, taste, and smell. And so you can't really appreciate food, you can't appreciate your lover's touch, it's said, so you become kind of this detached killing monster if you're at a cold night for too long. Although it is said to be a signal of your bravery and commitment to the Dark Elf armies that you'd be willing to do this to yourself and just become this kind of numb monster that rides on a dinosaur, killing and slaughtering as you go along. For the most part, Cold One Knights are armed with lances or swords. I think what Creative Assembly will do is split Cold One Knights into two factions, much like they did with Grail Knights. They'll make Cold One Knights with lances as a shock cav, and they'll make Cold One Knights with long swords as a kind of melee cav, because the Dark Elves don't have a lot of different types of cavalry, really. So I can see Creative Assembly making that split along those. In terms of their speed, Cold Ones are slightly slower than Empire Horse. So slower than Bretonnian horses, and slower definitely than Elven horses as well. So if they can catch something, they'll do great, but it's about catching the other unit that they need to work on. Once they get into combat, they'll be monsters, but they're not the quickest cavalry around, but they are horrifically violent, as you can see from the picture on the right. Now, in terms of some of the abilities of the Cold Ones as they transfer across to the tabletop, they would cause fear because it's a bloody dinosaur trying to bite your head off. That would scare the shit out of me. And they are stupid. Now, I don't think stupidity is ever going to be a rule that transfers across to Total War Warhammer. But effectively on the tabletop, you'd have to roll a dice. And I think if you rolled a 1, the Cold Ones weren't able to move for that turn of your combat. So that could really bugger you up if it happened in the wrong situations. But there's no real way of implementing that in Total War Warhammer, just due to the mechanics of the game and how it works. And that's about it for the Cold One Knights. Now, we also have the Doomfire Warlocks. The Doomfire Warlock were male magic users who were based out of the city of Hagrif. And when Malekith got word of this prophecy of demise I mentioned earlier, which is the reason there are no male sorcerers in the Dark Elf armies, he went to see the Doomfire Warlocks and said, look guys, you're magic users. I think a magic user might one day usurp me, so I'm going to take it out on you guys. And the way he did it was he used his own not insignificant powers to essentially tear their souls from their bodies to a certain extent and leave their souls teetering on the edge between our world and the realms of chaos. So almost kind of sacrificing them to Slaanesh, who devours all the elven souls, short of a few exceptions, or if the elves manage to save their own souls. So they're teetering between Slaanesh and the realms of the living. And how this manifests itself is that they have runes on their body, and these runes will start to grow and burn with an excruciating fire and continue to spread across their entirety of their skin until it covers them completely, and then at that point it consumes their soul and they are consumed by Slaanesh himself. They can, however, fight this off. And the way it works is, if they want to put off having their souls devoured by Slaanesh, they need to make sacrifices to Slaanesh in their stead. And the purer and more powerful the soul, the more time they'll buy for themselves in terms of their own mortality. So they're kind of on this constant ticking clock in terms of their own life. Now, because they were magic users, they can still use magic. These guys will operate not dissimilarly to Sisters of the Fawn for the Wood Elves. They should have magic spells attributed to them that don't draw from the pools of magic. So the magic spells they have attributed them in the tabletop is Soul Blight and Doombolt. Now, Soul Blight you guys will recognize from Total War Warhammer already, but Doombolt is one of the spells from the Lore of Dark Magic, which we don't have in the game as of yet. Those should be the two spells that the Doomfire Warlocks have, irrespective of magic pool. They are armed with melee weapons that are poisoned. So they have these poisoned scimitars that they use as weapons, which when they cut an enemy, essentially robs them of all of their senses. So they go blind, they go deaf, and that's just so that the Doomfire Warlocks can collect them up later and really put the ritual into the sacrifice to greater appease Slaanesh, so he doesn't eat their souls as quickly. So because they're halfway between the two worlds, that's why they have this kind of ghostly appearance. And that is the Doomfire Warlocks. They are also kind of a light cav, so they can fulfill that role, except these guys also have magical spells attributed to them. So I suppose these guys would be like the ultimate upgrade from the Dark Riders, because they kind of serve a similar purpose as far as light cav goes. They can ride down missile units, they can ride down artillery units as well, but they also have magical abilities attributed to them. as well as poison, and on the tabletop they also had a ward save, so they can be fairly hardy as well from both missiles, melee, and magic attacks. And that's the Doomfire Warlocks, once male magic users, now just these kind of horrendous deformities just trying to buy enough time by sacrificing to Slaanesh. Now, moving on from the Doomfire Warlocks, we also have, going back to some Cold Ones, we have Chariots, and we have the Cold One Chariot. Now, the Cold One Chariots are meant to be highly prestigious war machines. They are gifted to you by Malekith himself, so if you are riding one of these Cold One Chariots into combat, you are in good standing with the Witch King himself. This chariot would also cause fear, and it's said to have a crushing impact effect when this chariot goes crashing into enemies. So this would be a punchy chariot for the Dark Elves to have, and I look forward to seeing these Cold One Chariots rampaging around the battlefield, causing all kinds of mayhem. Although not looking forward to having the AI use it against me, that will be a problem. But there we go, that's the Cold One Chariot. The next chariot we have is the Scourge Runner, and the Scourge Runner is manned by Beastmasters. As you remember at the top of the video, in the Lord section, I mentioned the High Beastmaster. These are just regular Beastmasters, and they go around the countryside of Nagaroth in their chariots, which are armed essentially with a bolt thrower. So in a way, these are kind of moving artillery units, and they fire out a harpoon with a chain on the end of it, really designed for catching monsters, and they have nets and all sorts of things. So they're not sort of just a downgraded model of the Cold One, they would serve very different purposes. This is much more of a missile-focused chariot. Now, on the tabletop, the Scourge Runner, with the Beastmasters on it looking to catch more animals, when they face a monster on the opposing army, they could fire their bolt thrower, which can fire at any target, but when it fires at monsters, it gets them, the harpoon lodges itself in the monster, then the idea is that they use the chain to reel the monster in. So they can draw a monster closer to them. I think it was 3 inches on the tabletop, if I remember correctly. But they can draw the monster closer to them or displace it from its location, which in Total War Warhammer would be amazing to see. Imagine these guys just firing that thing into a giant and then just dragging the giant along for a bit, separating him from the rest of the army, allowing you to finish the giant off in a controlled manner, or at least putting him out of action for a little bit. That would be amazing to see, but I think just the way that animation would have to work, I can't see them implementing it for this one unit. But what they probably will have is there'll be a chariot with a powerful missile weapon on them with a bonus versus large. That's what I imagine. Now the idea is that this chariot also has nets, because they're beast catchers essentially at this point, so it would be cool if they had a net of Amantok equivalent, maybe a much smaller area that they could cast it over. That's kind of like them throwing out the net from the chariot, and they could catch units that way, maybe with a more limited range than a net of Amantok, and it would maybe appear non-magical on the battlefield as well. But it'd be good to see them maybe slowing down other units. Just that's more of a lore thing than a rules on the tabletop thing. But yeah, essentially a very mobile artillery unit, the Scourge Runner Chariot. Next up, we have the Bloodrack Shrine. Now, this is an interesting kind of chariot. It's propelled by magic, and it has a Medusa chained to the top of it. Now, Medusas in the Warhammer world, or at least in the Dark Elf armies, used to be sorceresses under the tutelage of Morathi, and she had them in her city of Grond, and she was teaching them dark magics, but these guys went a little bit too far. They started to use their dark magics, not just to rejuvenate the looks they already had with the blood cauldrons and like making themselves young again, but they started to use it to change their appearance, to make themselves pretty, and they were very successful at it. They in fact made themselves prettier than the elven gods themselves. At this point, the elven goddess Atarti, who is the elven goddess of pleasure and lustfulness, decided, that's not on, you can't look prettier than me, and cursed them all with these painful serpentine bodies. And not stopping there, she's like, no, that's not enough that you look like a snake monster now. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to take away most of your mind and your ability to think logically. So they've been kind of reduced to almost beast-like levels of intellect, but given just enough kind of human intelligence to remember what they once were and how powerful and beautiful they once were, just so their misery is compounded. At that point, you'd think, oh, Morathi might be pissed off at the goddess, but Morathi knows how to play the hand she's dealt, and so kicked them all out of her city, sent them into the wilderness, and then thanked the goddess for punishing all these upstarts, because she wasn't punished herself, because Morathi is already smoking hot. She didn't need no magic to make her look great. So she never used it to improve her look. So the goddess never took vengeance on her. So she just had to go out and recruit new sorceresses, really. Essentially, all the old sorcerers under her command fled into the mountains, hid, started living in underground lairs. And Morathi now, whenever she needs something, you know, a little extra oomph in a battle, she sends some troops down into the lairs of where these Medusas now live, and they manage to, at probably quite high casualties, capture one of them, and they chain her to this chariot, the Bloodrack Shrine. They also have witch elves guarding the Medusa, kind of looking over her, but these witch elves are very careful because the stare of Medusa, unlike in our own kind of ancient Greek folklore, the stare of Medusa in the world of Warhammer doesn't turn you to stone, but it causes you to bleed from every single pore you have. So you essentially just, all the blood leaves your body through your skin, leaving you as kind of a little puddle of gore at the end of it. To combat this, the crew of the chariot itself, the witch elves who are in charge of watching over this Medusa, cover their faces in this kind of mirrored silver mask, and that lends them some modicum of protection against the power of the Medusa. It's said that by her simple presence on this chariot, she has a number of different effects on the units around her. So because of her kind of eternal suffering in this body that causes her pain every single minute of every single day, the fact that she remembers how beautiful and how powerful she once was, and is very aware of all the horrible things that happened to her, the sense of agony from the Medusa is almost said to be palpable, and it causes this aura of agony around her. Now, enemy units, this puts them off. In fact, it gives them a leadership debuff, any enemy units around the chariot. But Dark Elf units get a leadership buff because they love agony. They delight in it. They pleasure in it. They can practically taste the agony of the Medusa, and it really revs them up. It also, of course, because it's a bloody Medusa chained to a huge chariot with massive spikes at the front, causes terror. It has magic resistance. The chariot itself has the avert your gaze rule. The idea is that people are looking away, trying not to bleed to death from looking at this bloody Medusa on this chariot, that they're taking damage from the magic attacks of the chariot itself. So all units within a certain area take damage. Damaging aura would be around this thing, as well as a leadership debuff at the same time. Now, all of that on top of the stare of the Medusa herself, which acts as a shooting attack on the tabletop, but I think will probably be translated across as a magic attack in Total War Warhammer, where she picks a unit and essentially does damage to that unit when she stares at them, because some of them are just bleeding to death out of their ear holes and eyes and wherever else they're bleeding to death out of. So this could potentially be an absolute damage train, not only debuffing your leadership, but hurting you at every moment. This could be a potentially horrific unit to encounter in Total War Warhammer, and I look forward to it, and hopefully they implement it with all those different rules it has from the tabletop, because the systems for it are already really in place in Total War Warhammer. The systems wouldn't be too tough an ask, and the model they can save time on, because Games Workshop, like Creative Assembly, sometimes don't like to make too many different models, and for the most part the Bloodrack Shrine model is very similar to our next chariot, so there'll be a lot of replicated work there. Don't blame CA, it's really Games Workshop that did it first, so let them off the hook on that one. And the next chariot we are looking at is the Cauldron of Blood. Now, I've mentioned the Cauldron of Blood a lot during some of the earlier parts of this video and during my Legendary Lords video. Now, the Cauldron of Blood has kind of mysterious origins. There's only a few of them around, and they're said to have been gifted to the Witch Elves from Cain himself, or at least that's the story Morathi tells people. She just kind of turned up with them one day. No one's really sure what they are. So they're these mysterious gifts supposedly from the god Cain, and they are constantly filled with the blood of sacrifices from the cult of Cain itself and from the witch elves. Now, although it's constantly filled up, the cauldrons themselves never overflow. It's as though the metal in the cauldron has a thirst of its own. The cauldrons are also the way Morathi uses to control the witch elves, because every year is on something they call the Night of Death, the witch elves sink themselves into the Cauldron of Blood, and they become young, rejuvenated, and beautiful again. The only person who this seems to have any kind of permanent effect over is Morathi herself. So, and if the witch elves at any point ever disobey her, she can withdraw this Cauldron of Blood abilities and they would not be able to become young and beautiful again. And that's really like the kind of crack cocaine she has them on, just eternal youth, but not all the time. Sometimes it can go back, much like Helbrun with her haggard appearance, but she's particularly old looking compared to some of the other witch elves. The rest of them are much younger than her, so the effect isn't quite as stark, shall we say, as it is on Helbrun. But that's how Morathi controls the witch elves, because she has the access to most of the secrets of these cauldrons of blood. And it's from these cauldrons that the witch elves drinks their frenzy potion, where they go nuts on the battlefield, and it's really tied into a lot of the worship of Cain, these cauldrons of blood. Now, for most of the time, these cauldrons, because they're very precious, are kept securely inside the temples of Cain, but when needs are dire, they put them on the chariots and march them out to the fields of battle. Now, Cauldron of Blood chariot causes terror because it's a lot of crazy women with knives, with a scary statue of an elven god, with a big pot full of blood, charging at you, propelled by magic, seeming nothingly moving it forward. So just a terrifying sight to behold. It's poison, because, you know, them witch elves, they love some poison. Has magic resistance. It has frenzy and gives people around it frenzy. And it has a ward save as well. So resistance to magic, resistance to missiles, sort of the all-round ward resistance we've seen in Total War Warhammer already. Now, as I mentioned, the special rule about the frenzy is called the Fury of Cain. It gives them that. It also gives units something called the Strength of Cain, where units near the Cauldron of Blood can re-roll fail to wound rolls on the tabletop. Effectively, that would mean increased melee skill in Total War Warhammer. So that's kind of the abilities of the Cauldron of Blood. Now, I think we'll see the Cauldron of Blood similar in implementation to the carts in the Undead faction. So you'll be able to get them as an individual unit, but also potentially as a mount for Helbrun herself. This would be her like ultimate mount, the Cauldron of Blood, and Morathi for that matter. And they could be units you could buy separately, much like the carts in the Vampire Count faction. So that's how I see them being implemented in Total War Warhammer 2. Okay guys, so moving on, we have monsters. Now let's start with, one we've been talking about a little bit before, the Medusas. Now some of the Medusas can be, if not coerced, maybe just decide to go into battle. They're just a little bit frustrated and sad, and they go into battle and fight. Now I think we'll see Medusas implemented in Total War Warhammer 2, not necessarily as single units, but as maybe a pack of 6 of them, maybe like trolls, and they'd be essentially a monstrous infantry. They'd have their stare ability, but only one for the unit, and that could do some damage to units you cast that on. But apart from that, they're decent melee fighters. They'd have to have, on the tabletop though, they have terrible leadership. Because they're in agony, because they're such miserable bastards all the time, then they don't have great leadership as monstrous infantry units. So I think they'd run away fairly easily, much like trolls do in Total War Warhammer currently. So that's how I see them implemented. So that is the Medusas. After the Medusas, we have the Harpies. Now the Harpies we already have in the game. I imagine they'll be maybe slightly recolored from the Beastman Harpies, maybe slightly reskinned as well. But we'll have the Harpies, and the Harpies do have a huge nest around the city of Karond Kar, and they nest around there, and it's said that they're sort of lucky and they defend the city, and if the Harpies ever left, the city would fall within a night. I don't think anything's particularly threatening the city. I just think that's like a little superstitious thing. Oh, the Harpies bring us good luck. It would all fall apart without the Harpies. Some in Dark Elf society believe the Harpies are the souls of witch elves reborn. Other believes they are just manifestations of Cain himself. But most just agree they're good luck and they're handy to have on the battlefield. They present a flying option for the Dark Elves, as well as the Black Dragons and some of their other mounts. These guys can accompany them, handle any fell bats or any of the sort of less impactful units in the air quite handily. But we've seen Harpies in Total War Warhammer before. They may just be, they'll be very similar to what we have already in the game, if not exactly the same. Now after the Harpies, we have the War Hydra. Now, the Hydras were discovered in Nagaroth when the Dark Elves first fled Ulthuan, and even at that point, once you learnt the territory of the Hydra, entire armies would divert themselves around the creatures. They were that ferocious and could cause that much damage. And it said that only the species of the Dark Elves could see such a monstrosity and go, you know what? I don't think that's vicious or monstrous enough. And so the Dark Elves set about capturing as many Hydra sort of babies as they could, rearing and really breeding them for viciousness, violence, and ferocity. And so they created this kind of subspecies of Hydra known as the War Hydras, more vicious and violent than perhaps their wild native cousins, and really just built for the express purpose of war. Now the Hydras themselves are very hardy. Not only do they have hard, scaly skin, which represents a kind of armor they have on the tabletop, but they also regenerate. So you have to chop off. The idea of killing the Hydras, you have to chop off all its heads in quick succession to kill the animal, otherwise it will just regenerate. The Warhammer Hydra does not grow back more heads than it has, it just kind of grows back the heads it did have. Usually led by Beastmasters with the whip behind them, the Hydras charge into battle. Now, an interesting rule about the Hydra on the tabletop was that the healthier it is, the more damage it does. So it will do decreasing damage the amount of hit points it loses. Now it will have regenerate. The Hydra has a certain amount of attacks and an attack per head it has. And the idea on the tabletop was every time you did a wound was that you were chopping off one of its heads. So it would lose an attack. Now there has been similar stuff where Creative Assembly have set up stat buffs or debuffs when health reached a certain point. Now, if they can tweak that system a little bit, it shouldn't be too much trouble for them to implement the Hydra perhaps getting a weapon strength buff and a melee skill buff, the more hit points it has. And then as it goes below, I don't know, 75%, 50%, 25%, it loses a certain amount of strength for every one of those barriers that it hits, which would create a really interesting mechanic around the War Hydras and really be truthful to the lore. There are those monstrosities, the Hydra. In terms of some of the special rules around the Hydra, it of course has Terror, it has the rules Scaly Skins, and it also has Fire Breath and Spit Fire. So the idea is Fire Breath is a breath weapon. Now, I've said this before, I'd like to see breath weapons implemented on dragons and monsters, kind of like the way the rings operate as the magic items. Other people have said the creatures that have breath weapons are using them. Yes, there is an animation for them, but I don't see it doing like a significant amount of extra damage when they're using those through the animation. It just seems like they may as well be doing any of their other old animations. Whereas if you have the breath weapon ability, you could really see, and that was on a cooldown, that could really be more impactful, and down to kind of user making the most of the breath weapons, much like on the tabletop when the breath weapon is used to maximum efficiency, rather than just have it be a random animation that pops on a monster from time to time. So that's how I'd like to see breath weapons implemented. And the spit fire idea is that it kind of spits a fireball out, and that acts as a bit of a missile. So it'd be cool if the Hydra had both a missile attack and fire breath attack on it in Total War Warhammer 2. With all the attacks and the health issues it has, kill it fast, kill it quick. Otherwise they will devastate any army you have. Now, moving on from the Hydra, we have an even more monstrous creature. We have the Charybdis. Now, the Charybdis, unlike the Hydra, which is a mountain-dwelling creature, is actually a sea creature, and it tends not to venture onto land too often. Now, the Charybdis is the golden jewel of a Beastmaster's collection. All Beastmasters around Nagaroth would love to have one of these monstrosities under their control. It takes a huge amount of effort to catch one. You in fact have to get a sorceress to use her magics to tempt it out of the deep where it lives and just eats on any creature it can come across. One of these is said to be more than capable of wiping out an entire Dark Elf army, and they are just vicious. Now, the Beastmasters take a lot of pride in sort of bragging about them being able to train one of these things, but the thing is that these things so much love violence and hunting and eating, that it really doesn't take much to get them into a battle. All it really takes is the odd flick of the whip just to make sure he's pointed in the right direction and doesn't end up eating your own troops. Now, this is a hardy and enormous creature, and it, like the Hydra, has terror, but it also has poison, it also has armored scales. And in terms of some of its abilities, it has something called the Abyssal Howl, which essentially on the tabletop would cause units to have to re-roll successful leadership tests, so essentially morale tests. But in Total War Warhammer, that's not really the way the system works. So in Total War Warhammer, what essentially that would be is, I imagine, a massive leadership debuff. On the tabletop, this Abyssal Howl did not affect units that were immune to psychology or themselves caused fear or terror. So you could have units that were immune to psychology be able to resist the Abyssal Howl. That would be a cool little touch just to stay extra true to the lore over there at Creative Assembly. But essentially it has this ability to cause huge leadership debuffs coupled with its terror. It could go in, have a huge charge against a unit, cause it this Abyssal Howl, and really almost break on most units in the game fairly quickly with that particular ability. It also has the Feast of Bones ability. Now, this is a fascinating little skill it has. Essentially, on the tabletop, if you picked a single model, so just most likely a hero unit or another monster, those would be the only things you'd really attack or put all your attacks into one single model of. If you landed all those hits, you essentially got another potentially 6 hits on it. I think it's as many as, forgive me if I get the rules wrong on the Charybdis, but I think it's as many as maybe 12 hits, which is huge. So essentially this monster is a monster killer. That's how you'd have to set it up in Total War Warhammer. So all that complicated rule I just tried to badly explain would essentially translate in Total War Warhammer as a huge bonus against large. This thing should be able to kill anything else that's big. It should be able to go there over to a giant and eat its face off. Like, this thing is a monster killer, and that's kind of the role it plays in the army. If you want a unit killer, you're probably looking at the Hydra with its fiery breath, its fireball spit. But if you want a killer of monsters, this is the thing you're after. You want something to bring down a giant, you want something to bring down a Shaggoth. Here's your guy. Last but by no means least, we have the Dark Elf Artillery. Now, the only artillery piece that the Dark Elves really have, they use it on their boats, they use it in their land battles, is the Reaper Bolt Thrower. Now, this takes the repeater crossbow technology and puts it into a bolt thrower. So the thing with the Reaper Bolt Thrower, I mean, think of the Dwarf Bolt Thrower. It's very similar in concept to that. But this has 2 modes of fire. It has the mode of fire of a normal bolt thrower, where a bolt's fired, and it has the potential to go through multiple units, at least on the tabletop. It goes through multiple models and can hit multiple at once with a single bolt. Or it can be used in its repeater function, where it fires a lot of smaller bolts at the enemy. So that would be a really cool little function. You could maybe differentiate between the types of range the 2 units had, and you'd have to switch between the firing modes. But I really hope they give it 2 firing modes and don't just give it the one like quick fire mode, because it'd be quite cool to make the decisions tactically on which modes you're wanting to use in against which enemy. But that's what the Reaper Bolt Thrower is. And with that kind of concludes our look at the Dark Elf army. Hope you guys enjoyed that. I wanted to do the army because it really paints a bit more of the lore of the Dark Elves and some of the units and what life is like within Dark Elf society. I didn't want to just have a run through the units and their stats and where they'll stand against each other. But for those of you who don't know much about Dark Elves, I hope this was enlightening. For those of you who do know a bit, I hope this was alright and I didn't get too many aspects of it wrong. But yeah, looking forward to the Dark Elves. As I mentioned, there are a couple of units I think would be hard-pressed to make the cut with Creative Assembly, namely the Fleet Master. I think the Corsairs are in danger there, as well as the Death Hags, or at least the Death Hags as a hero. But the Death Hags as an upgraded Witch Elf unit, I can definitely see happening. I think the Cold One Knights will be split into Lancing Shot Cav and Melee-focused Cav. But let me know if you guys agree or disagree with any of the points I've made in this video. Look forward to seeing it in the comments. Hope you enjoyed this one. Please do leave a like if you did, really helps the channel out. And do subscribe for more Total War Warhammer content. I look forward to catching you guys on the next one, and hope you're all having a great day. Alright guys, see you later.